Well, in this video, I'd like to discuss the descent towards atomism and the state's role in that descent. Uh, One of the very common uh, critiques that's leveled against libertarianism is that it in some way suggests or mandates a radical individualism, and that this implies then that we all exist as atomized individuals that don't interact with each other, don't cooperate, that we have to do everything on our own, that we can't have any kind of organization whatsoever. And this is, of course, a ridiculous non sequitur. Anyone who's familiar with libertarian writing, becomes immediately apparent that libertarians are, if anything, obsessed on how social interactions work, especially if you're talking about the economic libertarians, and that uh, these interactions are absolutely the pith of civilization. It's just that libertarians think that social interactions should follow certain principles, right? That there should be a lot of individual autonomy, that people should be given, um, uh, a large discretion in their choices as long as those choices are not directly harming others. That there should be freedom of association, that there should be market-based interactions as opposed to unilateral coercive interactions. Um, this is also this claim that humans are social animals, albeit true. It doesn't lend itself to any particular cooperative system, right? You could say, well, humans are not radical individualist, solitary creatures or social animals. Therefore, we need to have an absolute monarch to organize us, right? I mean, there are some pretty important works in political philosophy that argue for just that. But you could also say, well, we should have communism, or we should have democratic socialism, or we should have a mixed economy, or we should have a nation state like we have today, or a constitutional republic, or whatever else. To simply say that humans are social animals doesn't say anything as to what type of organization it should have, other than it not be radical individualist, um, hermits everywhere, which is not what libertarianism advocates. I mean, we respect the rights of somebody who wants to live that way, but certainly not prescriptively suggesting that everyone do so. And most of the principles and arguments of libertarianism look at both the utility and the deontology of having people cooperate voluntarily, and basically assuming that that's advancing arguments that that's actually the most efficacious way in whatever rubric we want to look at. Either it's in terms of wealth creation or virtue or um, self-actualization or whatever else. Um, but it's still true that we do need to cooperate, and there has, at least in certain respects, been a trend recently, or I don't want to say even recently, but there's a trend towards atomization. And in my video on communal showering, Black Acid Lizard had commented that the shying away of people who are no longer comfortable with the idea of, public nudity or getting together, and that is a symptom of the descent towards atomization. And it's a good question of whether that's simply an ongoing force, something that's always there, that there's always some tendency towards atomization, while on the other hand, there's some tendencies towards socialization, and these two forces are in competition with each other and not always well balanced. That I can't say, but for those who argue that, well, we're not atomized individuals and therefore the state, I think it's important to point out that at least currently, and I think necessarily, there are at least many aspects of states that lead to atomization. Now, there are aspects of states that don't lead to atomization. I think that there are arguments that you can make that in certain circumstances, under certain criteria, in certain specific cases where there are homogenizing effects or true social effects of states. They actually do have a social effect, and I mean beyond the self-serving, misleading rhetoric of politicians, right? There is some element to that that's very true and very real. On the other hand, there's also an element that is very much erosive of socializing, and that breaks people down into atomized individuals. Um, Now, I also think that there are other forces that lead to atomization beyond the state, so I don't want to make this video to imply that all forces of atomization are from the government. I can think of a couple off the top of my head that seem to do this. So one would be television, two would be video games. I guess you could say these are related. You can make an argument about how related government is to, say, television. I think it would be hard to make much of an argument if we're talking about video games, if we're not going to get into conspiracy theory land. But those are both mediums that seems like they would likely exist without government, and they do seem to have a tendency towards atomization. The characterization here is you go through a neighborhood at night, and instead of seeing people out interacting on their front porches, children playing, you just see glowing screen after glowing screen after glowing screen. And I know people who, they work, they have jobs, they're productive, and they come home and they play games. They go in the room and they play games, and then that's it. They don't go to the gym, they don't go out and, have fun with their friends. They don't do any of those things. And so, and I'm sure the others that, I could list and others could list. So again, I'm not implying that the only source of atomization within our society is the government. That's not true. But I think it is important to point out that in some very important ways, it does push us in that direction. So I want to list a couple of those ways. Some of them you probably thought of and some of them you probably haven't. So number one, and I don't mean this is the most important, and I think in the case of the United States, this is probably one of the least important, is subsidized and forced immigration. Okay, so I'm an open borders guy, but there's a big difference between having open borders and subsidizing immigration. We have a lot of communities in the United States, and they're relatively small, but they do exist. This is a much worse problem in a place like Germany or other European countries than it is here, but it's still a problem here, where you have these populations that are being they're being settled, and their settlement is being subsidized, if not even forced. So I've encountered over the course of my life a couple times Somali communities. There is no reason that these Somalians would be here other than the government is bringing them in and subsidizing their settlement here. They didn't come because of their labor being sought by entrepreneurs. They're not coming here because their immigration was desired by any force within the market of the economy. They're not coming here on their own means, right? They didn't pay their own way generally. And this causes a certain degree of breakdown, right? The society then becomes more heterogeneous, and I don't want to overplay this because in the United States I don't think this is as big a problem as it say is in Europe, but it is a problem. Number two, public schools. I think public schools are hugely destructive towards the socializing of people and leads towards atomization. Now, there's the rhetoric that they teach in public schools, and we could really debate that a lot. Do they teach things that kind of spread this idea or not? But that's not my main point. My main point is that they take the children away from their parents for months out of the year, hours out of the day. And not just their parents, their grandparents, their friends. Instead of forming the social bonds and the social organization that children naturally would, or that they would prefer to, or that they would find the most utility, they are kind of forced through compulsory schooling to attend public schools. And then they are split off into classes, they're itemized, they are, given a name, a number, and an identity within the state that is independent of their other social bonds. And again, independent of whatever kind of rhetoric is taught in the schools, just the fact that you're pulling the kids away from their families, their extended families, from their friends, from their churches, from whatever else, is actually probably one of the more pernicious and powerful forces that breaks down social bonds. Number three, public housing. And this is also related to schools too, because you have schools of choice and that sort of thing. The government creating these housing units that are made to concentrate certain populations, and you could say racial, but at the very least economic populations, is going to create ghettos, right? It's literally ghettos. Now, they're not Jewish ghettos from World War II, and they're again not necessarily racial ghettos, but they're economic ghettos. And they're cultural ghettos because you have these people who not only are they poor, but they're the recipients of welfare. And this, destroys their virtue in a lot of ways. Um, and again, takes them away from the normal social bonds that they would be involved in. So not only are they ripped from the organization, the structures, the churches, the families, and whatnot that they would normally be associating with, but they are concentrated as a class with people who are, it's interesting, who are then categorized a certain way by the government. So the government has created a new category if you're, quote, below the poverty line. And they then concentrate those people together when you're talking about housing and welfare and stuff like that. Now, not all poor people are in that situation, but it's common enough. Um, Number three, no fault divorce and basically the divorce courts in general. Now, I totally believe that men and women should, or women should be able to divorce, at will. But when you have a situation where they are given financial incentives to do so, where basically they will be almost always granted custody of the children, and then also their ex-husbands will be made economic slaves to them in the form of child support, that gives them a much stronger incentive to break the family. And this is probably the most significant element here. You have the most basic social unit. You have the individual, and then you have the family, and then you have the extended family, and whatever else comes after that. And to break that down at that level is extremely pernicious. And I don't need to recite here because it's, you know, very well known and undisputed that growing up in a single parent home is one of the worst things that you can do to a person in terms of the likelihood of a criminal lifestyle. Uh, and yet we have the government actively doing this. Now, is that in their intention? I don't know. There's cynical people who believe that it is. I think that historically there have been certain states that have kind of tried to do this. I've heard that in the Muslim areas of China, the Chinese government is very much pushing women's rights because they want to break down Muslim families as much as possible, because that network of Islamic culture is resisting to some extent Chinese hegemony over Western China. Um, Now, is that the case in the United States? I don't know, but even if it's not intentional, it's still happening. And related to this would be the subsidizing of bastards. The fact that you will give welfare to single mothers who have many bastards, as Herbert Spencer said. Uh, this creates these atomistic children, right, who are divorced from uh, the most basic social unit, and this is going to retard them socially, whatever other outcomes there might come from that. Um, so yeah, like these are pretty significant, each on their own, but when you take them all together, they're very significant. I think there are other things too. We don't have a freedom of association. This is a big one as well. Um, when you prevent this from happening, um, then what otherwise might be powerful social bonds are not allowed to form, or they can only form clandestinely. Now, we haven't completely abolished the freedom of association. It's still permissible in certain areas, right? But the government has, and especially after the New Deal or during the New Deal, has basically said that businesses, that anything that crosses the line from your personal choices to entrepreneurial choices or investment choices, there is no freedom of association, that those interactions fall under the seemingly limitless regulatory power of the government. There isn't a clear delineation of where their ability to regulate ceases when it comes to that that area. And I think this is actually quite significant. You can't have a bank that caters only to black people. You can't have um, a bar that caters only to gay people. This has become something of an ironic issue here, where we have gay bars that are getting frequented by straight women, something that most gay bars are not really that interested in. It's very difficult for them to criticize this without becoming blatant hypocrites, though, because these are likely the same people who would have cheered the forced association of patronizing a pizza place or a cakery, um, or a bakery. I guess you could call it a cake shop, whatever. Um, and the fact that these businesses, and to the extent that they form social units, and they very often do, that social development is interrupted and broken down. Now, again, do not think that the government is doing this on purpose. I don't think that is its point, but that is the effect of what it's doing. Um, the fact that um, it's mandating how the Boy Scouts can be organized, or how whether churches can or cannot grant certain marriages. This is, again, it seems like there's lots of other problems. There's moral questions and utilitarian questions when you talk about essentially abolishing or largely restricting the freedom of association. But one of the results is a breakdown of social bonds, and that can result in atomization. And you're starting to get that. If you can't have a bowling league that is whites only, or uh, people in your church only, or whatever else, then you end up, quote, bowling alone, to reference a work that has kind of studied this phenomenon, although it probably does not attribute it to the government. Uh, you even have, in kind of like a metaphor of this, the issuing of social security numbers, where every single person is simply numbered, and your most kind of fundamental identity is the number that the federal government has given you. It's actually quite disturbing if you think about it, and that your status in life is very much determined by that, and less by who your family is, and who your social circles are, and who you interact with, and who you choose to form social bonds with. Now, this still goes on in the United States. It's not like there's been a complete breakdown of all social organization outside the government. That's certainly not the case. But it's been damaged quite a bit. And again, I don't think necessarily intentionally, although possibly intentionally. We do have, in say the Old South, I mean, there was very direct attempts to break down Black culture and Black society in order to control it, right? Because any kind of social organization within a slave population is potentially dangerous to the to the slave owning population. Well, that incentive is still there when you're talking about a governing elite, if indeed you have a governing elite. Now, you can argue that, well, in a democracy, you don't have a governing elite. There's a ever new, everyone can aspire to join the government, and the government is the people, and so you don't have this elite. I don't think that's entirely correct. I think that it's quite evident that you have a ruling class that is much more politically connected and savvy and capable than the masses of the people, and that this class would have it in their interests to break down competing social organizations, whether they be churches, whether they be families, whether they be associations, right? It's interesting in the history of gyms, for instance. The modern incarnations of gyms, it's usually traced back to ancient Greece, and although there's certainly similarities between our gyms today and ancient Greece, the modern incarnations of gyms really began in Germany in the 19th century, and these were heavily frowned on by the Prussian government because they were seen as potentially subversive. Now, it doesn't appear, as far as we know, that any of them really were, that there was any kind of concerted political agenda among these gymnasium, but the potential that they become that way was recognized and discouraged by the government, and in many cases banned. And we don't have things getting banned necessarily in the United States, but we have them being regulated in a way that prevents them from developing as they might otherwise do, right? If you can't have exclusivity, if you can't have covenants, if you can't have selective freedom of association in your organizations, then you have to be, or in your businesses, the fact that you have to include everybody dissolves that capability to a large extent. I think there might also be something to be said here to key into one of my pet peeve topics with the gyms and the locker room scenarios, that there have become tort and legal issues that have made certain types of organizations very difficult because they're prone to legal attack, to torts. I think this is relatively minor and not one of the main reasons. I would definitely place the breakup of the family, the subsidizing of bastards, and the schools much higher than that. And again, I don't think the schools are necessarily intentionally made this way. It's just you're taking the kids away for hours out of the day. It would be, if it wasn't school, if they said, well, we're just making the kids, leave for 10 hours a day to do community service, they would still be exercised from their normal social circles, from whatever those may be, churches, Boy Scouts, family, whatnot. So it's an interesting question to say whether states, maybe if we could fix these problems and we just stop the state from doing all these things, could you have a state that doesn't lend itself towards atomization? I think that's a very interesting question. I'd have to say that probably not. Maybe this deserves another video, but I don't think that there are some intrinsic differences when you have a state that are going to tend towards this. Um, you know, the now the, how often are they explicitly attempting to do it? Not that often, although it's not impossible either. In the Soviet Union, the ancient practice of population disbursement and movement was widely practiced. This is something you read a lot about when you read about like the Assyrians or the Babylonians, and it's famous in biblical history because it happened to the Jews at one point, where you just say, okay, we're just going to take this population and move it someplace else. And that is deliberately intended as a control mechanism. You sever them from their land, from their culture, from each other, and then you put them in a situation where they're in an alien culture, an alien environment, and they lose a lot of their homogeneity, they lose a lot of their cohesion, they lose a lot of their power and their strength. And you have this up until recent times in the Soviet Union, and you have it today even in China, where you have the subsidized immigration of Han Chinese into Muslim areas. Right. Now, I don't think that the United States government is bringing in Somalians with that intention, but it is also it's the effect that they have. Um, so, and I would rank that as like the lowest of the things that I mentioned, other than maybe the tort reform stuff. But to just blithely assume that governments are more social and that they prevent atomization, I think is wrong. That especially in our case today, but I think throughout history you can't find any examples of a state that doesn't engender this, at least to some degree. Uh, it has an incentive to dissolve or to weaken to the extent possible uh, all social bonds and social organizations outside the state, because its power is relative to them, right? If you have really powerful churches, if you have really powerful, even unions are really powerful, market organizations are really powerful, social groupings, they can threaten the government, right? And so the government has no interest in alleviating them. Now they can try and unify their interests. That's to form an alliance with these groups, but that is dangerous, because when you have an alliance like that, if it's beneficial to both, then they're going to get stronger, and you have the potential then of depending on an alliance with an institution that you are making stronger, right? So, for instance, if you have an alliance with the church, that sounds great until the church becomes powerful enough to threaten the state, or vice versa. And and that's one thing. The government in the United States does not seem to have been able to attack churches directly. You could argue that they've attacked them indirectly through the public schools. There certainly are people, I don't know if you can say this of the people in the government, there certainly are people who view the public schools as a weapon in the culture war and see them as a tool to be used to attack churches. And this comes out most evidently in arguments about teaching evolution in school, because it's thought that if they can teach evolution in schools, they can discredit biblical teachings and Christianity. For some reason, they don't want to discredit Islam or Judaism, but they really want to discredit, well, for some reason. The reason is obvious. Christianity is powerful, and these other religions are not in the United States. Well, Judaism kind of is, but I don't know to what extent the intentions of those people who want to use the public schools are actually controlling public school behavior. I don't know. I know that it's viewed that way by some people. They would wish it to be used that way. I don't know if that's the actual way that they are being used, but like they do have that effect. I think churches are powerful enough in the United States that a direct attack is unlikely, at least now. But you see in other countries, in other Western European countries, where churches have been unionized with, where they form unions with the government, where you have a state church, and the churches there have completely withered and gone away. They don't have church-going populations. They don't have uh, religious communities or religious social bonds in most of Europe now, other than Eastern Europe and maybe Southern Europe. But in Western Europe, it's pretty much a dead letter at this point. And again, I don't know that that wasn't necessarily intentional, but it was certainly an effect. If you have cooperation and union with the government, but you're subordinate to the government, then the government is going to start to dictate how you can organize, what you can do, how you can meet, when you can meet, this, that, and the other thing. And these prescriptions are going to prevent you from organizing in a way that maximizes your own utility, and they're going to have a deleterious effect in the long run and potentially destroy those institutions. And I think that you've seen that with the churches in England. We haven't seen that in the United States yet. Uh, but yeah, I, like all libertarians, I have certainly nothing against human organization. Indeed, I value it very highly and think it's a miracle that how it works, and I strive to understand how it works, rather than simply say, well, we're social animals, therefore whatever cockamamie political scheme I have in my head is ideal for everyone and I should be imposed on everyone. Um, but it's ironic because the government is actually one of the chief causes of atomization, one of the chief reasons that we break down in society. And if you look at the people who are hermits, if you look at like the homeless people who have severed most of their social bonds, like a surprising number of them, a disproportionate number of them are actually veterans or people who worked for the government for a long time. Again, I wouldn't classify it as one of the main reasons, but it's kind of interesting that kind of intensive direct exposure to government work and service and government power can lead people to become the actual hermits. So anyway, I'll talk to you all later and have a good day.